Our aim is to recreate that sort of biosphere level peatland on a massive scale, and unsurprisingly, everything begins with water, and we need flowers, and of course from flowers we'll build insects. So we really want to reinstate an extraordinarily complex botany on the site, and that's going to be really very difficult.
The aim in any rewetting project that we might do, and Emblehope is one of them, is to restore the dynamism and the natural function of that landscape.
Welcome to another episode of Rewilding the World. I'm Ben Goldsmith, and I am very happy to be sitting here with Ben MacDonald and Gil Martin from Restore. Ben, of course, the author of Rebirding and Cornerstones, a guy who's really opened my eyes up and my heart up to the possibilities of rewilding in this country. And Gil, who I last saw a couple of years ago when he showed me around an extraordinary and beautiful wetland restoration project in the lowlands around Bristol before he joined Restore. And Ben and Gil are on the podcast now to announce some really, really exciting news. Ben, Gil, thank you so much for joining me. And I'll leave it to you, Ben, to talk about what you've done.
Thanks, Ben. Well, it's been a hell of a team effort, much of it led by Gil here, but delighted to announce on your podcast first anyway, that Restore will soon be the very proud owner and custodian of the Emblehope and Burngrange estate in Northumberland, which will be 7,500 acres dedicated entirely to the restoration of the natural world to the very fullest extent that we can possibly manage here in the UK.
And I got a little bit of a glimpse of the hustle behind the scenes to make this deal happen. And as ever, it was down to the wire. And I'm glad to have played a small part in helping Restore get there. I'm amazed that this property belonged to the Kennel Club. Like, how did that happen? It's so eccentric, the whole idea, that you've bought 7,500 acres of upland from the Kennel Club. Why did they own it, and why were they selling it, and what is it?
This property has been on my radar for a long time, maybe 5 or 6 years. So owned by the Kennel Club, as I understand it, because they had some funds after the sale of a London property, and they put those funds into a landscape so that it was a place to house the money, but also a place for them to engage in some of their activities like field trials. I'm not entirely sure that they used the whole 7,500 acres for the field trials, but they certainly have built a kind of national field trial centre with a great reputation where people came from all over the world to participate. 5 or 6 years ago, I investigated buying it because it stood out in the English landscape as a rare, almost unparalleled opportunity for nature restoration. Not only is it a kind of blank canvas ecologically, the Kennel Club have done a good job of managing it, but there is a hell of a distance to go to the kind of optimal ecological horizon that can be achieved there. But just its sheer size and proportion in terms of an English landscape, 7,500 acres, that's 30 square kilometres, no big gilded main house, no roads bisecting it. It's essentially this kind of great big amphitheatre of nature restoration potential. And it always stood out to me as an opportunity that had to be pursued. I failed 5 or 6 years ago. And shortly after joining Restore, there's some whispers of it coming to the market. And I was pretty determined that we would be the first people to go and see it, the first people to put an offer in, and we would snag it and be the people and the organisation to deliver this incredible opportunity for nature. So I'm chuffed that we got there.
Gil, where exactly is Emblehope? What's the nearest station? And is it all upland?
So Emblehope is in Northumberland. Northumberland rapidly becoming a county of rewilding and nature restoration activity, a kind of Cairngorms of the north of England, or as we've referred to it, the kind of as a Yellowstone, an English Yellowstone. And when we say that, we're not really referring specifically to Emblehope. What we're referring to is the combined impacts of multiple landscapes being managed for nature, of which Emblehope sits in the centre like a kind of missing jigsaw piece. And so when you add together the national nature reserves of Kielder Head and of Whiteley Moor, and you add Wild Kielder, which is 6,000 hectares, which is an immediately adjacent area of Forestry England land, which is being managed with a new nature objective at its core, then you end up with a kind of 35,000 acre area of land, all connected, all next door to each other, all being managed with nature as its primary purpose. So it really does deserve the accolades of Cairngorm National Park of the north of England or England's Yellowstone. So Northumberland, near to Kielder, it's in a sparsely populated part of the world. It's not terribly easy to just jump on a train and end up on the doorstep, but all of that is part of the wonder, part of the glory, and part of the opportunity for nature.
And what about Rothbury? We had Craig Bennett, who runs the Wildlife Trust, on the podcast earlier this summer, and he spoke mostly about their big acquisition in Northumberland, which is the Rothbury estate, which he bought from Max Percy, younger son of the Duke of Northumberland. And that's of a similar kind of size, a little bit bigger than Emblehope, and not far away.
I think that's very exciting, Ben. We were baking away at the Groundswell Festival, and Rothbury's site manager dropped in for a nice cool drink, and we had a really good chat. We were just talking about the amazing connectivity that we have between Rothbury, between Emblehope, between one of our clients, College Valley Estate, which is 13,000 acres in the Cheviots, and as the golden eagle flies, all of these landscapes are connected, and hopefully they'll become more connected, more trophically connected for some other animals that could move between them in the future. So it's all incredibly exciting. I mean, we're absolutely backing that last push on Rothbury, and we'll be delighted when it gets over the line.
Ben, can you paint a picture for me, please, of what the landscape is like now in terms of ecological vibrancy? How does it feel to be standing in a remote part of Emblehope today, and how you'd like it to feel once you've got your hands properly on it?
I think at the moment it's easy to underestimate how much life is just beginning to show signs of recovery. So walking the moor this summer, you've got sphagnums, you've got heather, you've got some really interesting birds of prey. So the parts that are just showing us what the moor can become, just beginning to kind of recover in the wake of some quite concentrated grazing in the past. There are other areas where I think the baseline is much lower, and we've really got our work cut out. And I think the overarching picture is that for a bog, Emblehope is staggeringly dry. You can be standing there in summer and you're not even up to your ankles in water, let alone your knees or your waist. When it comes to what the landscape could be, I don't believe we have anything in England that sets the bar sufficiently high for what we're seeking to achieve. We put a huge amount of emphasis on peatland as this kind of giant two-dimensional soggy sponge, as if it's simply a substrate, whereas my understanding of peatland from the great bogs of Estonia or Finland is it's this feathery, complex three-dimensional landscape with dwarf bog pines, little stands of birches, areas so wet where you suddenly disappear, up to your waist, areas too wet for trees to grow. But in the drier areas, the trees then push back and surge in and burst out of the tussocks in these little randomized Tolkien-esque kind of dwarf formations. And it's this extraordinary variety that we probably haven't seen at Emblehope for the best part of certainly well over 1,000 years. And we get little glimpses of it in the Cairngorms, in the bogs of Othi Mercus or the Spey Valley, or the little tiny bits at the edge of fields often that have escaped intensive grazing or intensive drainage. But, our aim is to recreate that sort of biosphere level peatland on a massive scale. And unsurprisingly, everything begins with water and with hydrology. And our principal ecologist, Dr. Ian Maltzer, who we're very lucky to have coming to us from the RSPB, is really looking forwards to the challenge of, how do you really raise the water table in a landscape that's been really systematically drained all the way from the Victorians onwards. So we all know how good the Victorians were at drainage. So I think we're going to need a lot of international inspiration to really bring this site to life.
Because so much has been lost in Britain that you simply can't find that many examples of this, and certainly none at scale. And so you've talked about hydrological restoration, and I want to ask you, Gil, in a moment about that, because that's how we met. I saw the hydrological restoration you did in a lowland estate in England. You blew my mind that day. But before I do, Ben, what will we have on Emblehope? Once you've restored that natural hydrology and restored this expansive 7,500 acre bog, which of course sits in this patchwork quilt of other rewilding projects. I don't know if you mentioned the Heppel estate as well, which is right next door. They sell their famous gin from the wild juniper that grows across their increasingly wild land. What kinds of wildlife would you like to see there? And what kind of birds? What will it sound like to stand out in the bog once this restoration is underway and birds have started pouring back into the landscape?
I think the staggering thing that dawned on me when I went to the Bieszczba marshes in Poland for the first time is that you're not supposed to see 1 snipe or 10 snipe in the air in late spring. You're supposed to see about 500, like a cloud of gnats. They just happen to be wading birds. And I think it's the great abundance that's been lost from the UK, actually more than the diversity. In the UK, we still have curlew, we still have lapwing, we still have them in their sort of 1s and their 2s behind their electric fences on little nature reserves, or sort of in driven grouse moors where we have to rig the entire system in order to keep onto those populations. But imagine having a population of snipe in the 400, 500, 600 pairs. So I think that, abundance that is the glorious byproduct of the hydrological restoration is going to be really important. The other thing we forget is that our uplands, a bit like the rest of England, are staggeringly free of flowers, and it's so basic that we've lost sight of this. So when you walk across an Estonian peat bog or a Finnish upland, there's an extraordinary abundance of nectar, which means invertebrates, small invertebrates, which means thousands of curlew chicks, thousands, tens of thousands of snipe chicks, all able to put on the calories that they need to grow into adult birds instead of, your sad last pair of curlew just flying around 28 years old. They come back every year until they die, which is the norm now for curlews in England. So to reverse this, we need water. And we need flowers, and of course from flowers we'll build insects. So we really want to reinstate an extraordinarily complex botany on the site, and that's going to be really very difficult. Often it's these kind of less sexy elements in rewilding that some people can overlook. We're all excited, of course, about, the tarpan proxies and the aurochs proxies and the beavers, and those animals are absolutely critical. But for me, the biggest difference between those kind of Estonian and Finnish systems and what we are seeing at Emblehope at the moment is just the absence of nectar and flowers and everything else that builds from that basis. So once we put those back, then I think we're going to see an extraordinary number of wading birds, and that then brings us to some species we might be able to reintroduce in the future.
Does that mean you'll be having to sow flowers, Ben? I mean, will you literally be pouring seeds out from drones or something, or will restoring the water be enough to bring the floral diversity and abundance back?
So, to be unexciting, the first year, Ben, will be almost nothing but a baseline where we establish what is there, what we think will self-express, and what we think is beyond self-expression. So often landscapes that have been subject to very heavy grazing by sheep have lost a whole suite of plant species that simply may need to be put back, whether sown, whether as plugs. That will come out of our baseline and our ecological plan over the next year to 18 months. We don't necessarily need to act in a great hurry on this landscape, especially, a landscape of this scale and complexity. But I think you'll also be amazed, or you personally wouldn't be, many would be amazed, how many trees of different species are hidden in the landscape, waiting to self-express like they did in Glentromie and Glenfeshie, perhaps buried, just suppressed for hundreds of years, but the arboreal seed base being quite robust, they will have remained, and they'll spring the most glorious surprise in 5 to 6 years' time. So we don't want to cut off all the surprises that nature can spring. But there are certain bird species, for example, redback shrike, black grouse, where the science tells us that these species, once they've become extirpated from an area, simply cannot recolonize in happy couples magically without human assistance. Of course, the same human assistance took them from the landscape in the first place. And I do believe that in those cases, we have a duty to put those species back.
Gil, when we first met, it was at Belmont Estate near Bristol, where you showed me a recently restored floodplain reconnection wetland project along the bottom of a valley that really blew my mind. I mean, I couldn't believe the extent of what you managed to do on what is a relatively limited amount of land. Can you just remind me what you were doing there and tell me what you learned from that project that you're going to take to Emblehope? Because as Ben just told us, restoring the hydrology and rewetting that much, much bigger landscape is the absolute key to bringing back all of this vibrancy and diversity.
Sure. So on the Belmont project, we were trying to restore the hydrological function and dynamism. That's probably the key word here that I'll keep coming back to, of a floodplain and of a river corridor and of a river itself. And you're right, it's a brilliant project and a brilliant showcase and a springboard to connect people to that sort of work and the impacts and the benefits that that sort of work can generate, given that it was just outside Bristol and so very accessible. And it plays to what's so exciting about both Emblehope and, in truth, Restore. So the key thing for me is natural process, is the dynamism and allowing a landscape and the function of that landscape to be in charge of the outcomes. And so that's actually quite difficult. When we talk about rewilding, we're really talking about a jigsaw puzzle where we know we don't have all the pieces. We know we can't finish the jigsaw. But how clear can we make the picture? And then what do we do about the missing pieces? So then back to Ben's point about some of the interventions and interjections that you might make to boost botanical diversity or species diversity. And of course, getting the diggers out and restoring hydrological function. But to be really clear, the aim in any rewetting project that we might do, and Emblehope is one of them, is to restore the dynamism and the natural function of that landscape. So I'm so excited to get on site, and it'll be intervention heavy in the first instance as we kind of block drains and gullies and we restore that hydrological function and we make an intact functioning raised bog once more out of that landscape. But the ultimate aim is to not need to persist with those interventions. The ultimate aim is a self-sustaining, functioning kind of ecosystem. Now, we'll have plenty of work to do, plenty of interventions to make to get that process going. But Emblehope has nearly 1,000 hectares of peatland of varying depths. That is, genuinely a rare thing in England especially. So it's a genuinely special project to be working on. And what I think is particularly exciting from our approach is what I think you'll find if you look across lots of peatland restoration projects, both in Scotland and increasingly in England, is they're driven by the Peatland Carbon Code. Now, the Peatland Carbon Code is an excellent thing. Lots of these codes are hugely useful for driving the flow of investment into restoration and ultimately catalyzing that investment in the first place. But any code that tries to be a kind of one-size-fits-all for any type of restoration ends up having to draw its boundaries and its lines somewhere. And so what we'll find is that peatland with a depth less than 30 centimetres is excluded from the code and therefore excluded from a lot of people's restoration plans, where Restore's starting point is ultra ecological ambition. So irrespective of the codes, irrespective of the perhaps the revenue opportunities that we might talk about later, our first principle is restore that hydrological function, restore the dynamism, restore the natural processes. And so that will include every part of the peatland on that landscape, whether it qualifies for the code or not.
So I've got a vision of huge diggers. How do you do that? It's so remote, Emblehope, and presumably the scale of it and also the inaccessibility of it makes it somewhat prohibitive. So how in practice will you do that?
Really carefully. Nearly all of it is a designated SSSI. It's in poor conditions. There's plenty of scope for the recovery of that SSSI. But we'll have to be mindful of its designation as we work. But if you think about some of the peatland restoration projects across the Highlands of Scotland, some of which I've been involved in, the skill and experience and ingenuity of the practitioners allows for some rapid rewetting and restoration of hydrological function on those landscapes without the importation of lots of kit and material. So we're talking about plugging and transplanting to block the flow of water out of a landscape. So that entire 1,000 hectares of Emblehope was once acting as a fully loaded sponge. And over the last several hundred years, through management practice and some deliberate drainage, that sponge has been wrung dry, and all of the water that lands on it exits really quickly and really easily through gullies and drains and channels. And it'll be our job to block those gullies, drains and channels and fill the sponge once more. And we'll do that, let's say, with excavators, but we'll try very hard not to import too much material and to do it with on-site material. So plugging where we can and patching up using the landscape around us.
Ben, your book, Cornerstones, opened my eyes to the role played by certain species in the healthy functioning of landscapes, particularly, for example, wild boar. I think it's the opening chapter of Cornerstones, is how you fell in love with nature, was the sheer abundance of butterflies and wildflowers in landscapes that were being gently rootled by families of wild boar. With this restoration at Emblehope, what's the role for these kind of keystone processes? Because you haven't yet talked about any plans to bring back large bovines, for example, or wild boar, or some kind of domesticated hardy pigs. Will you have any big animals there now or later?
We most certainly will. But the question is, what is the most naturalistic use of those animals? So we want to be bringing them in to deal in the very first instance with some specific issues that we can see which can evidently profoundly unnatural. So a complete absence of grazing is as unnatural on the one hand as a set stocked moorland with, a very high density of sheep. So at the moment there's a kind of dead grass layer lying across a lot of the moor, which for me is just crying out for, really low density of free roaming horses that would do a wonderful job of hoovering it up with natural herd dynamics, chasing one another around the moor, very much as I've seen in the highlands of Mongolia. And of course, that really hardy animal that stayed in the open in the high hills in the middle of winters that would have been, minus 20 back in the old days, would have been the tarpan. And then, of course, we've got the lost role of the aurochs. And, we're obviously going to be looking for a bovine that is extremely hardy, because if you've been at Emblehope, even in late spring, it is a brutal and inhospitable place at times, like something out of Game of Thrones in the depths of winter. So we will be certainly looking for some very hardy breeds functioning in, very low stocking densities that, again, can roam across that landscape, disrupting some of the heather, spreading dung, creating the dung beetles for the curlew chicks, and rebooting that whole system. The final thing that's exciting about Emblehope is that, should we wish, the site is amazingly well fenced in two ways. It's fenced by Kielder Forest, and it's also actually fenced, which, again, for 7,500 acres, is extremely unusual. So when we come to our much beloved Iron Age pigs, Ben, there'll be a lot of conversations to be had. But I think certainly without the rootling of pigs, I think there will be areas of compacted pasture, of dense molinia, where only the pigs can really get under and create that fresh, lightly rotivated, aerated soil that nature just loves to recolonize. So very much those animals are on our radar. But I think right now we're just focusing on hydrology first, and then bringing them in as we better understand not only what the landscape is like right now, but what it could look like even in 18 months of ditch blocking. It's going to be very different. We may even need a different form of bovine that's better at getting its feet wet.
Gil, so there's about 1,000 hectares of bog that you're planning on restoring, but the property is 3,000 hectares in total. What's the other 2,000 hectares, and what are you going to do with it?
So, yeah, correct. About 1,000 hectares of bog of different depths and different condition. Then there's some patches of Sitka spruce forestry block, which we'll be working hard to restructure and possibly remove with great care, because actually it's one of the few three-dimensional elements in that landscape. So although the long-term picture is not to have Sitka spruce, I want to make sure we do so with real care, so we don't remove a key habitat feature. Or at least until we've replaced it with something more natural. And then there's acid grassland, there's riparian features, so river corridors or burns, where we can see wandering scrub, or we will be able to see wandering scrub and natural regeneration. And the mission here will be to make a patchwork quilt where we don't view that landscape as one habitat over here, another habitat over there. The reality of a healthy functioning landscape is that they are all intertwined, intertangled, a patchwork quilt of different habitats all overlapping and connecting with one another.
Ben, we talked about big mammals. We haven't talked about smaller mammals. Like a key part of the grouse moor community's strategy for maintaining populations of wading birds and, of course, the grouse that they like to shoot is the wholesale and unrelenting massacre of mesopredators, for example, mustelids and foxes and also kind of raptors and so on. What's your plan in terms of smaller mammals, the smaller predators in relation to restoring wading bird populations, and what will just appear anyway on the land as you restore the hydrology and the ecology?
One of the learnings I had in Bieszczady in Poland was how on earth do you have 500-600 snipe in the air next to probably the highest density of predators in Europe? So de facto it can't be predator driven. I think if there's enough food in a system and there's enough scale and enough chaos and enough areas where waders can put their nests inaccessibly, then you can have very robust populations of wading birds, as we see in many parts of the UK, but of course all of Scandinavia. Nowhere is employing intensive predator control. You can still pass trees that look like they're sort of some sort of black Christmas decoration that turn out to be 200, 300 black grouse just in a couple of birch trees, and see extraordinary volumes of waders in the air. But you have scale, you have water, and you have nectar. And from that, you have the basis of a really viable system. But that said, as we know, we don't have at the moment any wolves or, as of right now, any lynx in the Northumberland landscape. So like on some of the other estates we manage, we do some proxy predation. And that's not designed to create a surplus of grouse. That's designed to just replicate the fact that foxes are unusually common in the landscape. If you go to the Masai Mara, you don't see many bat-eared foxes because they've all been driven into seclusion by lions, by hyenas, by those, mega predators that we've not had in a very long time indeed. The lynx is an incredibly capable predator of the fox. It really lowers fox densities and therefore actually, without the lynx being aware of such matters, increases wading bird productivity by reducing predation upon nests. And of course, in the long term, Ben, those are the kind of ecosystem dynamics that we'd be loving to see at Emblehope.
Can we talk a little bit about your earlier project in Bedfordshire, which has been in the news quite recently because you brought beavers there? I'm amazed at the scale of it because it's not far from London. Tell me what that project's been all about for the last 2 or 3 years.
Well, this journey began when I gave a talk at Groundswell on abundance. Was very privileged to meet, like we are with all of our clients, a quite inspired landowner, Charles Whitbread, Mr. Whitbread, owner of the South Hill Estate in Bedfordshire. The estate is 11,000 acres. And we're operating across around 4,000 acres of it. So similar, slightly larger scale to the much more established NEP project. One of the joys of this project has not only been working with a like-minded landowner, but how do we get the vision in our heads percolating down into reality, into 50 ponds, into 3,500 muntjac deer, taken on a one-way holiday, extraordinary pulses of vegetation. And the answer actually lies in working with, one of Britain's most inspired gamekeepers, a chap called Paul Dunn. We've been able to pivot what on paper looks like a traditional estate, even though it's really not very traditional, it's very forward-thinking, towards active rewilding. In just really 3 years of interventions, we've seen cuckoos, grasshopper warblers, huge increases in nectar and invertebrates, systems-led ecological restoration. But in that case, Ben, that really has come from us playing the lynx and the wolf on a massive scale, removing muntjac and Chinese water deer with a kind of ruthlessly efficient ground operation. And from that, we brought back nectar, scrub, nightingales, cuckoos. Everything has flowed from really just a couple of actions. So it's been really very cost effective as well. And I think that's something that we're now starting to do on farms and estates across the country. We can't be buying Emblehopes every week. And it's great when you've got landowners and farmers willing to be pioneers in this journey. Who wants to be the next Charlie Bubble? And, that's been really inspiring, actually.
Gil, Restore is a business, and you've just bought Emblehope for a lot of money. How are you going to pay for that? What's the business model for generating revenues from this bog and wider ecological restoration activity?
That is a really key question, partly because we're a business that seeks to make profits so that we can scale our activities and do more of the things that we're most passionate about. Partly because as a sector, we're not the only business in this sector. There's us and other organisations such as Nattergal doing similar things. And we need to be able to prove a commercially viable opportunity. What we need for nature is momentum and traction. And so something like Emblehope, I think, can be a key catalyst to generate that direction of travel and that momentum. We had to go and raise the money to buy Emblehope. And so that in itself was a bit of a challenge, and it required some creativity, and it required some faith from some different parties and some support. There's no lack of support out there for flagship projects which really deliver for nature. And so we created a kind of blend of capital, which included investment equity, it included philanthropy, and it included some debt from Triodos Bank. And that in itself was a fairly unique way to approach buying a landscape. And so although it provided a few headaches at times, it's, I think, a really inspiring blueprint for how this can be done again. And part of that was to be able to demonstrate a revenue stream. So out of all of this nature ambition needs to come some revenue to support the activities and to support some of the initial investment. And so we've created a system that allows corporates to participate in this nature restoration opportunity, not through direct offsets necessarily, but through support for that ecological ambition, support for restoration activity. We've created our own product called a 30 by 30 restore product, which I won't go into too much detail here, but that distills down the opportunity for corporate participation into inputs, into activity rather than quantified outputs, because there's quite a lot of variability in nature outputs. They're very difficult to quantify confidently. There's a lot of change. They're really important. They really matter. But if you tether your transaction to that, what you get is risk, and risk is the enemy of a transaction in the natural capital sector. So we quantify our activity by the inputs. We still share the outputs; they're really important, but we give those to the corporate buyer rather than sell those to the corporate buyer. And so, by bringing that revenue opportunity together with that innovative funding stack, we're able, I think, to unlock more Emblehopes and to start to really kind of generate and catalyze that momentum that our natural world needs so very dearly.
Yeah, this idea of nature as critical infrastructure is really having its day, finally. And of course, we don't know exactly how that's going to pan out yet. And as with any new marketplace, it needs a bunch of innovative thinkers and doers to try things out. And I think what you're doing is incredibly exciting. But it's just so obvious to me that a restored peat bog that holds massive amounts of water, as well as sequestering massive amounts of carbon and delivering nature recovery on an extraordinary scale, is absolutely vital and critical infrastructure. They're helping to protect communities from flooding whilst supplying them year-round with a steady supply of clean water and so on. So monetizing this shouldn't be difficult. It just needs to be done over and over, in the same way that I remember when solar started. I began my career investing in renewables and kind of environmental technology and so on. And I remember my late Uncle Teddy, who was an old greenie with a beard and kind of open-toed sandals. I remember him putting a solar panel on his roof in his house in Richmond. And it was incredibly expensive and it didn't work. And you think today, 20 odd years on, solar is the most mainstream of asset classes. We need nature as infrastructure to rank alongside solar and bridges and toll roads and hospitals and student accommodation as vital infrastructure. So I think we're moving in that direction. And of course, if that does work, the amount of money available for restoring nature will be unprecedented. There's $10 trillion under management in the City of London alone. There are pension funds and insurance companies and so on. You only need a fraction of 1% of that money allocated to nature, and there will be Emblehope's up and down the country, hopefully connected with wild corridors. And Ben, this is really what you've articulated so well in your books, this idea of bigger, better, more joined up, to quote Lawton. Are you an optimist? Are we going to get there, do you think?
I do, Ben. I think there are so many vast areas of land where the conventional models are not only unsustainable, but nobody will take them forwards. And therefore, the new markets and the entrepreneurs and the risk takers, of which we currently appear, the radical pioneering end, eventually there will be lots of restorers and nattergals buying land, restoring communities, creating social trust and selling natural capital. And there will be far more of those than there will be driven grouse moors or deer estates. It's simply a matter of time. And what we're seeing at the moment with a lot of the resistance to animals that could live beside us, like the lynx, is simply a period of change and a period of transition. So if you think that 5 years ago my business couldn't have existed, and now there are probably 10 nature restoration businesses of scale in the UK buying between them hundreds of thousands, in the low hundreds of thousands of acres of land, that is an extraordinary uptick in business productivity and the creation of an entire new sector that didn't even exist, really, more than 5 years ago.
What about, you talked about grouse moors and deer estates. What about landscapes that are actively farmed, albeit with very uneconomic activities, such as upland sheep farming? There's somewhere between, 30 and 40 million sheep in Britain. A lot of those are crammed into remote upland landscapes in the national parks and so on. Certainly for the last generation or so, they've been kept on the hill throughout the winter. So the ecological results are plain to see, but there's a very, very important cultural and economic thread that runs through those landscapes, which is the farming community. So what do you say to that? How do you protect that rich cultural history whilst also delivering the kind of nature recovery we want to see in landscapes which aren't grouse moors and deer estates, but are in fact farmed landscapes?
I think the solution there is different. I've always been very inspired by the hills of Hungary. You have the truly wild biospheres in those cases in the Carpathians where the wolves and the lynx hide away. And, that's what Emblehope seeks to be, an unapologetic biosphere for nature. But we're not claiming that the whole of the UK can or should look like that. When you look at the history of the Lake District, 200 years ago, it was absolutely alive with corncrakes, with black grouse, with songbirds on the hillside, with red-backed shrikes following the cattle, eating the dung beetles. It would have looked and sounded more like the Picos de Europa in Spain, the Agder Lake National Park in Hungary. And the great irony, of course, is it would have been home to far more farmers. Small farmers are an endangered species today. We've seen a catastrophic decline in the rural population as a result of intensive farming that often poses as bucolic and traditional, and it isn't in any way at all, from the use of nitrogen all the way through to ivermectins. We've taken small-scale farming out of the countryside, and biodiversity has suffered. So I think there's a different model. There's a cluster model, and there's a real kind of looking at what was agricultural history. It didn't rely on chemicals. It didn't rely on set stocking. It was much more integrated and probably much more socially, much more fair before everything degenerated into lines and enclosure. And I think returning to that is something that, I've spoken extensively with people like, James Rebanks, and I think that's really important. But somewhere there have to be the places where nature really does come first, like in any other country, from African national parks to the US.
Gil, are we going to see lynx back in England? You talked about the Yellowstone of England up there in Northumberland, and you've got all these landscapes that are connected up. And of course, if you cross the border, you've got Langham not far away, which is that big community buyout, I think now called the Taras Valley Nature Reserve. It's possible to envisage more than enough connected habitat for lynx. So the obstacles are presumably social and political. Do you folks at Restore think we're going to see lynx back?
So the obstacles are real. Those social and political obstacles need to be treated with care and with respect and with due process. But we will be creating the scale and the connectivity of landscape and the habitat suitable to house and home lynx and other species. And if lynx are going to be reintroduced in England, it will be in the Kielder area. And so we are very keen to explore that with all of the respect and responsibility that process really requires. But our first job will be to create the platform that can support those reintroductions. Then we'll go through the process. And I would not be surprised if in less than 10 years' time, we three are standing on the hill at Emblehope, witnessing a special reintroduction.
Gil and Ben, I'm just so excited to have had you on the podcast. I'm so excited to know you. I've loved your books, Ben, and I urge anyone listening to this podcast to order Rebirding and Cornerstones if you haven't already. And I'm also tremendously grateful forever to you, Ben, for introducing me to your publisher at Bloomsbury, which then led to the publication of my book, God is an Octopus. And I hope there'll be not only the unfolding of magic at Emblehope that you've described, but that there'll be many more like it in the coming years. Thank you both so much for everything you do and for taking the time to join me today.
Thank you, Ben. Pleasure.
Thank you for today, Ben, and for your help with Emblehope.
I feel so privileged that Ben and Gil's gigantic news, the news of the rewilding of 7,500 acres at Emblehope in Northumberland, has been announced here on this Rewilding the World podcast, and I just can't wait to get up there and visit. If you feel as excited as I do about this news, and if you enjoyed the conversation that I just had with Ben and Gil, please do give us a like or a review on whatever platform you use to get your podcasts. Spread the word among your friends and colleagues about Rewilding the World. It all makes a big difference, and I'm truly grateful. Next time, I'm going to be talking gardens with Tom Stewart-Smith. Gardens make up an enormous proportion of our land surface area, more than all the Wildlife Trust reserves added up. And there's a great debate in the horticultural world raging about how wild our approach should or should not be in respect of our gardens. Well, Tom Stewart-Smith is a legendary garden designer who's won and been involved with winning gardens at Chelsea over and over, and also who designed the iconic rewilding garden at Knepp. Join us for a conversation with Tom Stuart Smith about the wilding or not of our gardens.